So I guess I wanted to just start it off with a more broad question about how you guys think about growth. What does that mean to each of you? Maybe we can start with Siqi.
It is making a number go up. And you can go really deep onto the constraints of these numbers and the time lengths of numbers, but fundamentally you have a number and your job is to make it go up as fast as you can.
Growth to Yik Yak means finding more people that love the product. It means like growth, but never growth at all costs, because like short-term spikes of low quality users isn't worth it for kind of the damage that can have on long-term engagement. So more users who love us.
Gotcha. So more of a long-term perspective. What about yourself, Hiten, one of the original founders of the analytics industry?
Oh wow. Why am I here then? Aren't we competitors?
We are competitors.
We're not, because I just don't give a shit. But I think you grow or you die. And if you're in a startup or a business, you need to grow or you die. And so growth is probably the only thing left out of all the excuses of why you're not growing, is you're just not thinking about growth. So I think you grow or you die. And growth to me is like everything.
Absolutely, yeah, especially here in Silicon Valley. So I'd love to talk about, when you think about within your organizations, how do you build a growth team? What roles should you, when you're starting to think about, okay, let's get some growth-specific roles, people focused on that area full-time. What roles do you start with? How do you structure the team? What sort of backgrounds do you look for?
My background was in product marketing, and it was at Google, so it was very, very data-driven marketing. And I discovered that most of the things I worked on, like user acquisition, landing page optimization, A/B testing in products, there started becoming a name for it. It was called growth, and I realized that was kind of what I was doing anyway. And so I kind of got into it as that. But only person in growth, like dedicated to growth at Yik Yak. I'm on the product team, product manager of growth. I think that's a good position to have as your first growth hire, like someone who is very close to the product, can kind of influence product roadmap, kind of understood as being a bridge between marketing and design and engineering, because you really need all sorts of departments participating in order to be successful. And then after like building a bit of a reputation, rather than go and hire a ton of like specialists or so, it becomes more of like trying to get all other departments involved. So I have a growth team technically of the entire company, because all of them are dedicated to growth. It's kind of like about getting that, I don't know, I'm losing my vocabulary, but getting everyone to believe in growth.
You're trying to infect growth through the organization.
Yes, exactly. I'm a plague.
Yeah. Like viral or something, right?
Yeah, I know. Going viral. That sounds good. Yeah.
I think growth is a particularly tricky role to hire for. At Zynga, for example, what they found to work for them is hiring people who are used to be investment bankers, because they're really good at making numbers go up, at least for a time, kind of like Zynga. Shots fired. Okay.
He used to work there.
I used to be head of product there, so I can make that joke. Sorry. So what I think is a better role, a better type of person to hire for, and this is why it's really tricky, you want someone who's super creative, and usually those people are like out-of-the-box thinkers, kind of soft, and someone who's really, really analytical and good with numbers. And usually those two aren't the same person. And for a really growth person, you want someone who can be creative and can think of new product features and is incredibly rigorous and disciplined about numbers. And that's just a tricky hire in general.
What about yourself, Hiten?
I mean, in most roles, especially early stage or first hires, unless I have a specific expertise, I'll go hire somebody who can learn really fast in that area. And so, when I think about you, Julie, she worked at Google, and let's say she came across my desk, so to speak, right? The fact that she worked at Google would be a negative in my opinion, because it's not a startup. I'm trying to hire a growth team for my startup, whatever. But then if I met her and then she started saying the kind of stuff she was saying about, she says they're data-driven, great. But then she went into like other things about like how much she liked that, right? And if you probably dug in, she would probably tell you all these things she hated about Google, and that's what I'd be looking for, right? Because that type of person is like, this is shit, I want to make it better. And that's a fast learner in my mind. That's what I mean by a fast learner for like a growth team.
You want someone who can get shit done.
And thinks everything is shit. And then knows how to make it better. That's the other part of it. Because a lot of people think everything's shit, like me, but like I don't always know how to make it better. While a growth person in a growth role needs to be able to feel like they can find the important shit to go work on and actually go get shit done. Lots of shit.
So very much like a founder in a lot of ways. You both have to recognize when that there is breakage and also not be spooked by it and know how to go tackle it. Julie, you said something interesting that I want to follow up on. So, as the first and only growth person at Yik Yak, when you first came on board, what was your like very first priority in the growth role when you first joined the company?
Sure. So everyone at the company wanted growth. No one really had a sense of what it was. They just wanted numbers to go up, right? So my first priority was just understanding what the numbers were saying. Like there was not really a clear-cut understanding of what a power user looked like, what a casual user looked like, how people tended to move from becoming new users to existing users and what made them lapse. And so really building that sort of foundational understanding, all those slides like made it into the most recent, like the first board deck within like a month of me joining, and that really like kind of set the tone for like we are going to have like analytical rigor around understanding what our users are, and not just think, oh, I think the numbers are going up, it's probably good, or what happened, it went down, let's try a bunch of stuff because we don't really have a theory for what happened or not.
Yes.
So, yeah,
so being
analytics, yeah.
Being rigorous around the definitions of what a casual user is, what the KPIs are, all of that.
Yeah, because especially that makes you be able to set like what is the key metric that the company should go after. Like what does success actually mean? It's not just total active users. It's for us, it's like the % of active users who use it more than a certain number of days a week, because we want to be a lifestyle social network type of company.
Gotcha. So not just like top line metrics, you're actually looking at, okay, at what level people are engaging with the product.
Making more people love us. Yeah.
Awesome. So one interesting thing I think that we talk a lot about at Amplitude, and that a lot of other famous organizations, when it comes to growth, talk about a lot, are finding your magic metric. And so Facebook, for those of you who haven't heard, had a famous study where they found that the best predictor of whether someone was engaged long term was how many friends they added. So if you added 7 or more friends in the first 10 days, you were much more likely to retain. And that was a better predictor than many other things in the product. And I think Twitter had something similar, and Airbnb had something similar. I guess how do you go about thinking about that magic metric? Like, first of all, is there a magic metric? How do you go about thinking about that? How do you find it within your organizations? What is that for you?
After I heard about Facebook's magic metric, I think everyone was thinking, oh man, they must have done some really crazy statistical correlations on it to find this magic number, and was exactly 7. And so, we spent a lot of time looking for ours. And recently, I think about last month, I talked to someone on Facebook who was there when they figured out that magic number. And what happened was they had some idea that having more friends on Facebook was a good idea. But they couldn't prove causation versus correlation, and that was a challenge I think a lot of people have with finding a magic number. So they walk in a meeting, and Zuck goes, guys, you really think that people are going to use Facebook if they don't see any friends? This is our magic number. And they're like, okay. And turns out that worked really well. And so I think first, it depends on how you define magic. Like if you think of magic as sort of this magical thing that is going to be causative for your success, that tends to not be the case. I think of magic more in a sense of it aligns a team around one single metric, and people can unify it, all of your decisions are made easy, and you can move really fast. In that sense, it's magic, and it's largely driven by strategy.
Fantastic. And how do you guys think about magic metrics at Yik Yak, Julie?
Yeah, so one of the first things I did when I joined, well, first of all, was to get us on Amplitude. And then after I got us on Amplitude, I swear I made like dozens and dozens of cohorts of new users who had done this, had not done this, tracked them over time, basically trying to recreate what our version of Facebook's magic metric was. I basically did my own version of the growth discovery engine before it came out, and I found kind of the same thing. There's a lot of things that seem correlated with people being more engaged. In fact, if someone does anything, the more someone does, the more likely they are to be engaged. And that's probably what all of you guys are going to find out if you try and search for this magic metric. And so it was really hard to try and figure out what is this magic number. And eventually came to the conclusion it doesn't really exist. It's more like, what is the metric that you want to have the entire company working toward, that you think will be most beneficial to the company? And so for us, we'd seen some indication that if you post content, if you reply to content in your first day, then you're very likely to be engaged. And when we thought about it, we thought, well, if we get the entire company kind of united around a goal of let's get everyone to try and create content on their first day, I mean, that's an excellent thing.
Yeah, so it's more about getting the entire company agreed on what is the key objective and what is the metric we're trying to optimize, more than it is figuring out what exactly is going to be the best predictor as the best
like
correlation.
5 replies or 2 replies or 1 reply, that's less important.
Absolutely. Hiten, how do you think about that? Finding a magic metric, especially given you've worked with hundreds of companies over the course of their career.
Yeah. I mean, what's happening right now is that there's 3 of us on stage talking about growth, and we're basically telling you that one metric that matters is a fallacy, right? So let's talk about why it's a fallacy. The number one reason is that stories are better than reality. So as you started, you said, like, we've heard about this. Well, the fact that we heard about it means that at some point people are going to fact check it, like Siqi did, and realize that, again, a story is better than reality, right? So, in operationalizing this or using it for your business, it's probably too idealistic, right, to be honest. And there are companies that have found one metric and done something with it, and it's been helpful to them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can go analyze your data or your user base and come up with this metric. So it's part data and part art, right? Science and art. And that's how most things in growth are, quite frankly, and this is no different. Now, if you want to give, for me to summarize this, I would say that if you can figure out the one metric for everybody to focus on right now, that's a good thing. And so that's why companies really like the idea of this, and they'll try to implement things like this. What I've seen is that once you solve one problem, there's another problem. Once you solve that problem, that old problem might be a problem again, right? This is very common in supply and demand situations, right, for example. And so I think it's a fallacy, and at the end of the day, at the same time, we need alignment on our teams. So that's why it's very important to think about, is there a metric that we should be focused on right now? It's probably something that's going to change, though.
So it's not as much about finding something that's magically going to change your business than it is more about aligning your team around a common goal.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So talking about maybe shifting gears and talking about stuff that has worked very well, can you guys all share maybe one growth experiment that has paid off within your companies?
The best feature we've ever done on the last product we worked on was a feature that took 5 minutes, and it was literally adding a notification badge on our app icon, and immediately increased our retention by 40%. And for the next months, and we make sure to back test it. Okay, is it sustainable? Is it going to? No, it just kept on going there. And so eventually, after we did the badge icon, we built a feature so that we could have a badge icon. Yeah, so that was it.
Push notifications. Yik Yak is an anonymous platform, so we can't use tools like email for retention purposes. So push notifications are a really, really powerful tool. We had never really done win-back notifications in terms of, like, if you haven't used the app for a while, let's try and get you back. So that was one of the first tests that I tried. And it was a relatively simple test to do. Like, a group of people who have not used the app in a while, have a control group, have an experiment group, send out a notification to the experiment group, and then we saw, lo and behold, like, they returned 4 times higher than the control group. But it didn't end there. Like, the people who return on their own from the control group, you would think they would, in general, be like better quality than people who got a notification and returned because of the notification. Because people who return from control returned on their own organically, so they should be better. Actually, people who got the notification were better at retaining even after the first push notification was sent. And we think it was because we kind of reminded them of why they liked the app in the first place.
Julie, you said 4 times higher, is that right?
Yeah, than the control group.
That is massive. That is a massive difference.
For me, this is more of a lesson. I think I keep learning it over and over again, which is we once added a form field, and we increased conversions by adding a form field. So the lesson I keep learning is that, and prior to that, we thought less form fields equaled higher conversion based on the experiments we had run in the past. And I'd say growth, optimization, all that stuff, it's a lot more nuanced than these rules. And so I would just give you guys all a tip, which is if you're doing growth and running tests, just try testing something you don't think will work, because the context might be different now, or the traffic might be different, or honestly, the world might be different where that's a better thing to do now that things have changed, right? And so I keep learning this lesson over and over again. So I'm pretty loose with test ideas now, a lot looser, as long as we're aligned around what problem we're trying to solve.
Fantastic. Julie, you were talking earlier about product features that made a massive difference to growth. Or what was I think you had a really good example from Yik Yak.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I discovered was if you reply on your first day, it makes you really, really engaged. So we started thinking of what are all the things we can do to try and encourage people to reply. And we launched reply icons, which is within a thread, everyone who replies to the original piece of content, the Yak gets a unique icon just for the duration of the thread. Still anonymous, but you know who you're talking to. And that resulted in a complete step change in terms of the percentage of people who would reply and the number of replies that they would do in a thread. We used to have threads that had, on average, maybe 10 or so replies. I would see threads with 10 replies, with 20 replies. Now I'll see threads with nearly 100 replies. And it's not completely out of the ordinary to see that. So that just completely changed it because it made replying more fun. It made it more rewarding.
I see. So being able to have your users actually have a conversation and engage with each other.
Exactly, yeah. And it was also really funny for a while because you had to upgrade to the latest app version in order to see reply icons. So people who were on older versions would reply to themselves, and people who were on the newer versions could see that, but the original poster didn't know that they could see that.
See, so people
so
were
they look kind of foolish.
Making fake accounts and trying to make it look like they were saying witty things, huh?
Yeah. Oh no. Well, someone would post something, and then they would reply to their own post. Reply to their own post saying, "This was a very smart thing that you said."
That's pretty funny. I definitely don't do any of that myself on Yik Yak. Siqi or Hiten, what about you? Product changes that have had a big impact to growth.
Well, our newest unreleased product was just going step by step and figuring out what is the next blocker. And so the last thing we did was we integrated Twitter in this test. And we hypothesized that in this game, people want to see people they're interested in collecting or whatever. And that seems to have worked really well and has resulted in a 3x improvement in retention.
3x. That's a really big change.
We're at 80-ish% for day one. A really interesting test we did.
80%? Isn't game industry standard 40%?
Yeah, it's probably going to do pretty well.
No big deal.
So a really interesting test we did at Serious Business, and then later on we did at Zynga too, is so we were on Facebook and we did a lot of tests of A/B tests of notification copy. And over many months, we found that, hey, we have a corpus of around hundreds of notification copy. So we can run regression tests on this. And one of the really interesting insights is there was almost a linear correlation between click-through rate on a Facebook notification and its length. And it was a negative correlation, so the shorter it was, the more likely people would click on it, and the longer it was, the less likely people would click on it. And this is across, a data set of hundreds of just random pieces of copy. So I thought it was fairly interesting.
Awesome. One thing I wanted to ask you guys about, how much do you think of when you're talking about, I think Julie, you brought this up at the beginning, investing in growth for the long term versus the short term. I think when you're running experiments, a lot of times you're looking at things on a short-term basis and you want to get results so you can make changes. How do you balance that with making sure you're doing things that are good for your user base for the long term? So, for example, any notification, any channel that you have, whether it be email and notifications, that immediately will show, oh yeah, if we have this, I'll have higher engagement. But is there a risk that you're not seeing the longer term there?
Yeah, so definitely always our goal, always in the back of our minds is long-term growth, sustainable growth. That kind of is counter to our growth experiments mantra, which is as many experiments as possible, because basically the more experiments that you run, the more success that you're going to have, because we tend to be bad at predicting what will succeed, what tests will succeed or not. And so I'd say it's more like a philosophy that we apply to any sort of test. It's like, if we do this test, if it were launched out as a feature, would I as a user feel annoyed? Would I as a user be less likely to use Yik Yak in the future? So as long as we keep
more
that
qualitative,
it's more qualitative than quantitatively tracking someone over many, many months, because that tends not to be sustainable.
I can take that as well. Well, one, I'd love Siqi to teach us all about holdback tests, because I think that's one way to prevent long-term issues with something. So
maybe explain that for people.
The holdback tests that you're talking about. So you should talk about that. Outside of that, for me, what I found is that there tends to be better results when you try to do things that are on the edgier side of things, and better results meaning it either fails or it does exceptionally well. So the way I like to think about it is I like to do instrumentation so that I can understand the feeling, the customer satisfaction impact. So in B2B, we would just do Net Promoter Score before and after changes to different groups of people and just make sure that we didn't hurt our satisfaction. Pretty sure in consumer you could do the same thing. So I just try to find measures to understand the impact of these changes if they are edgy ones, but in my experience, those are the ones that tend to work the best, so I wouldn't want to prevent a team from testing those kind of things. So there's all kinds of tools, one being satisfaction testing after and before, another one being small percentages of users, or you hear a lot of large companies test in New Zealand or Australia or Canada or something like that. It's because they're trying to make sure there's no negative impact and there's a low risk population you can do that with, whether it's a low percentage or some specific country or something.
Siqi, do you want to share maybe kind of how you guys thought about that test?
Yeah, I think generally with analytics, so two difficulties are things that are really difficult to measure and things that take a really long time to measure. And on some features, you kind of have an inkling that, oh, this is working really great in the first 3 days, but I suspect it's probably not going to be good 3 months from now. Case in point was our red notif on app, where it's like, this is great. Is it going to regress? And so what I find really important to do is just leave 1%, 5% of your users in a group where that doesn't happen, and just leave it. And you just never get a new feature. And you can look back 6, 9, 12 months from now and see what actually happened.
I see. So not pushing every single change to everyone, but having a small group of users that are on the old product just to make sure see how you're doing versus that.
It's kind of really hard to execute on that, because your engineers are going to yell at you saying, we have this legacy code I've been maintaining for the past 12 months. Can we just strip it out?
Definitely know that problem.
Yeah.
It's like a super control.
Yeah.
So one last question, just to wrap things up, maybe a little quickly, and then open it up to the audience for questions for the panel. And what's the biggest mistake that you've made from a growth perspective over the course of your career?
Oh, that one's easy. We've been working on this product in my current company for many years, and picking a product that is inherently private. It's a journaling product. Inherently private has no growth channels, and you pretty much have to rely on Apple's largesse of featuring you to grow. Is probably not a sustainable business model. So my tip on that is, as a growth person, if you're founding a new company, you really have to bake in your distribution and user acquisition strategy from the get-go. And we kind of did, except we were completely wrong. So
I'd say on one hand, I will say run as many tests as fast as you can. On the other hand, I would say make sure your results are statistically significant. I used to work at Hipmonk, which is a travel search site, and we would often make judgments on whether an A/B test succeeded or not based on what people had done within like a month. And in travel, that's actually not nearly long enough because people don't travel that often, and so the long-term impact like was not. We made some wrong conclusions because of that.
So not paying attention to statistical significance.
Yeah, statistical significance and like correct length of time for an impact to be fully recognized.
Yeah, I'd say the biggest mistake would be, I like the not running enough tests because that's totally true, and then making sure that they're measured right. I think the waterfall of that, or the next step, is like making sure there's always a test that you can run as the next test, even if it's a stupid one. And the reason is your cadence of testing has to be maintained for people to understand that you're testing a lot and you always need a test running. So we now have backlogs of tests that we know might not work or might be dumb, but they're ready because we always want a test running in the key parts of our funnel. And it doesn't matter if it's a dumb test, it's just good hygiene. And that forces engineering and all kinds of other folks to build these systems to make that happen, and that's critical to growth.
Hi there, my name's Tom. I'm a product manager at PlanGrid. I was just wondering about the working on growth and working on data when you're not at that kind of statistical significance level. So maybe that point at Hipmunk when you are needing to run tests for more than a month, but you're having to make product decisions and you want to make decisions on data, but you just don't have the time to wait for that statistical significance. What advice do you guys have for that level, or how that influences product?
Andy Johns has a really cool graph. There's a scale of, on the y-axis is amount of thought that goes into an experiment, and then the x-axis is like size of your user base, and then the graph kind of goes like this. So the fewer users you have, the more thought should go into every one of your experiments, and the more users you have, the less thought that can go into any of the experiments, because you can run a ton of them. So when you're small, the advice to run as many experiments as possible is probably not right. You should focus on a few high-impact tests.
I just wanted to add something real quick. More thought can be like vague. I'm not saying you're trying to be vague, and so the way, and we've had this problem, so the way I try to describe it is, let's just go get more data, let's go do more research, not for statistical significance, but to inform that thought, inform that decision, because you can't run so many tests early on. The other thing I would say is that, like, and you mentioned this kicking it off, which I think was great, is your first hire should be a product manager on growth. That's a good strategy. So that means that I think growth is product and product is growth early on. So, and I've been in these situations even recently where, like, I know nobody knows about growth when I'm in the room, but we're having a product meeting. And so I just start inserting product growth crap, and it works because nobody's thinking about it, right? So it's just the thoughtfulness of thinking about how's that going to help us grow. And sometimes that already brings out the better ideas.
I'd probably focus on qualitative data. For our new product, that's what we did. And just on a weekly cadence, usertesting.com, amazing service, throw it out there. And what we did for every sprint is like, what do we learn from last user test? What are we going to test in the next user test? And you get really interesting insights at high bandwidth from very few people.
We try and talk to a user every single week. Like, even though we're at like a really large scale now, we still try and talk to, because it's mainly used by college students. No one at the company is really a college student anymore. So it's really easy to get like kind of distanced from what your users are actually thinking. So especially when you're small, getting a lot of qualitative insights from your users is really key.
I had a question mostly for Julie. I wanted to understand what your brainstorming test process is like. I get a lot of people who just like ask me for shit all day long. So I'd like to hear what your process is like, and then how do you decide to what to work on first?
Sure. So brainstorming for tests, they have to be tied to goals that the entire company has already bought in on. Otherwise, it's too easy to be like, oh, why don't you run this test? It's a good idea, isn't it? But if you can point to, like, will it actually move one of our key metrics? And if the answer is no, then you can, like, discount it, right? So we have goals around, like, getting more users in. We have goals around getting more activity around certain features, like taking photos. And we have goals around retention. And so all of the ideas that are submitted, we ask people to, like, label what kind of test they are. We ask them to always have a hypothesis of how much they think their test will move this metric by. And this can be hard at first because no one really has any idea before you run any tests. But you kind of force them to like put a stake in the ground of like, I think it's going to move it by this. And then they can look afterwards and realize how far off they were, how close they were, and that kind of makes people more and more accurate. So eventually when you run enough of these tests, you can make your judgment based on, is it moving our metric, and is the estimated impact higher than these other ideas in the backlog.
Hi, my name is Karen. I'm a growth product manager for Yahoo Mail. My question is, I feel like there's a delicate balance between setting up an infrastructure for growth and making sure you're ready for high volume testing, but then also showing that having a growth team is proving to have results. So how do you balance those two things, making sure you're ready in terms of infrastructure, but also showing that you're having results quickly?
Yeah, I'm the only person dedicated to growth at my company, and that has worked for a while. It's getting a little strained now, but I think what's key is even if you're the only person working on growth, your job is to get everyone else at the company bought in and participating in growth experiments as well. So every week I have what I think is the most expensive meeting at the entire company. It's a growth sync-up meeting. Both founders, the CEO, head of engineering, head of product, head of marketing, head of community development, all in a room and talking about what experiments they want to run. The co-founder runs his own metrics on whether his tests that he had ideas for were successful or not. So in some ways, you can like activate the entire company to be dedicated to growth. And once that engine kind of gets going, it becomes pretty clear where the needs are. And in our case, it's data analysis. Like, people are complaining they can't run enough experiments because they don't have time to analyze data. So then you can say, all right, we need to hire someone dedicated to data and know that you're not like growing too fast.
How do you choose the marketing channels for startups? What are your recommendations? How do you choose marketing channels like Facebook, Twitter? You have display ads, you have printing ads. I can choose USPS to post ads, put it in the mailboxes. How do you, for startups, what are the best strategies that you can recommend on marketing channels? Because marketing is one of the key component in growth to attract new users.
I mean, early on, usually a company searches for a channel. Usually it's not paid, and so they're trying all kinds of things that are organic or built into the product. So that's usually tends to be your first channel, especially on a mobile app, right? And then over time, I think most markets, like based on the type of audience you're trying to get, the channels actually become very clear, unless you're trying totally obscure stuff, like trying to market a B2B business on Instagram. It might be a good idea, but that's more of an experimental channel. So the truth is, you just experiment with channels, find ones that work, and work to whatever you're trying to do at the time, and then you're basically doing that all the time. So early on, it's usually product-based. Long term, it ends up being just an experimentation method of always finding new channels and knowing what stage your channels are at. Either they're an experiment, which is just out there, they're an experiment which you know is most likely to work, or it's maintaining a channel that already exists that you don't want to fuck up and you want to make sure you keep making it better.
This is actually something we think about quite a bit at Amplitude. I think, at least for us, it's kind of like, get in front of your users where they are and then just make stuff that's useful to them. That's kind of our philosophy when it comes to the marketing side. So make things that are useful for product people. I think Yik Yak, you guys did a bit on college campuses. So it's just thinking about, okay, who are your users and where are they at?
When I joined Hipmunk, they hired me because I had a lot of paid advertising experience. And so they hired me and said, you're in charge of our paid advertising, but we don't have much of a budget. So that became not an option. And so, especially as a startup, like the marketing channels that you choose, especially to acquire new users, I would always think about like what your competitive advantages are versus like probably much bigger players in the space. We were a travel site. Expedia could outspend us anytime. On anything. What we had, though, we had like iOS and Android developers who were like the biggest fanboys you could imagine of their respective platforms, completely dedicated to making the app like the best it could possibly be. And so we ended up striking up partnerships and long-term relationships with Google and Apple, kind of showing we would stop at nothing to really like drop everything and get ourselves optimized for iOS 7, for Material, and we ended up growing a lot through being featured and partnerships like that. That was our advantage.
I would caution that with saying make sure that your app makes money. Because, yeah, we execute the same strategy, and 1 million users that don't generate any revenue ended up not working well. So it really depends on your business.
How do you segment your A/B test results? I find that when I run tests, I find that there are lifts in certain segments. For example, iOS users versus Android users. There might be a lift for Android users, but not iOS. So how do you look at segmentation in regards to your A/B test?
What you're talking about is a super common scenario, and it's literally just about not just segmenting on A and B, but segmenting on A and B and the segments against A and B, like channels or whatever, or in this case, device. And then the extension of that strategy is if you have the ability to have statistically significant amount of traffic and conversions on those segments, you would start testing those segments separately. So if A wins for Android and B wins for iOS, you do A on Android and B on iOS, and then you iterate that way. And that's a core segmentation. I've seen companies even take that approach and say, okay, your Android optimization growth, and you're just doing Android because that's a whole different type of intent and customer base. And then someone else or a team is doing iOS. But if you're not segmenting stuff like that, you're not going to figure that kind of stuff out. If you don't have enough statistically significant traffic, it's not even worth doing it.
So we got one more last question over here. Back here, guys.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about structure. So I'm a growth PM, and things were going okay. And then once I got a growth engineer, that is someone completely dedicated to growth, it really took off. So we're thinking about adding a growth designer. At the same time, we're also thinking about whether or not growth should funnel up into marketing or into product. So love to hear from there.
I'd say there's no perfect structure. Different companies organize growth teams in different ways. Uber has a growth org. There is a VP of growth who reports to the CEO. Other companies, Yik Yak has growth reporting up into product. It really depends on like what organization, what structure allows you to get shit done. Right, and that also, if the product team is very well respected, then have your growth team report up to there, because then stuff can get done. If the company seems really invested in everyone wants to be involved in growth in some way and wants to support it, maybe it's its own organization. In terms of what you need to hire, I mean, it sounds like from your experience, you know what you need in order to accelerate like what you can do. You hired the engineer and you got a lot more done, and you think design is now the next step. As long as that you can like indicate that to the company, and you can show that after hiring the designer that your effectiveness improves by a bunch, then that's the right way to do it.
Echoing her thoughts, but like even going deeper, a little bit deeper into it, like I just start thinking about what are the values at the company? Are they written down? And use those as your reasoning and basis for how you want to structure the team, right? And it's not just, it's like when you go find values in a company, you need to align with them if you're working in the company, and I think people often forget that, and that a lot of times will dictate how you need to structure growth teams. The other thing I would say is, like, I think all three of us would agree that there isn't like a growth team that looks the same at one company and another company, partly because of people, but also because you have to be culturally aligned, right? So you should just think about all the time, what's preventing me from getting shit done? I love that description of it. And then make sure that you're hiring against that instead of like, oh, this person wrote a blog post about these 3 different ways. Let's go pick that random way, right? Instead of being thoughtful about it, of like what your company needs and when it needs it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciated. Siqi, Julie, and Hiten, thank you so much for taking the time to share your guys' experiences and growth.
Thanks for having us.